Caught. Touchdown. Marvin Harrison Jr. making a huge impact.
Here's Edwards with the lay. Donovan Edwards down the sideline. Gets past Ransom. Donovan Edwards. Touchdown, Michigan.
Welcome into another edition of our preseason preview series, where today we're talking Big Ten. I am welcomed by my buddy, good friend and partner, Mike Bainbridge. Mike, this is your conference, man. Your Wolverines. You've got the cap ready to rock and roll.
Had to. Yep.
Any overlying thoughts or themes before we kind of get into the team previews here?
Do you want to talk about how Michigan's going to win a third straight Big Ten title? I mean, I could talk about that for a half an hour.
Well, the question is whether or not they're going to win the national championship. When are you going to take the next step, Mike?
Hopefully this year, because we'll get into it. This is the year though for Michigan. They have to get it done this year because they'll have some turnover on the roster, but we'll dive into that later on.
Yeah, look, we'll have fun. We'll stick to the script right now. Let's start out with Illinois. And, the one thing I love about the Big Ten, there are going to be a lot of questions up and down this conference. Should be a great show. At Illinois, the one thing that we know is tried and true right now, and that's Isaiah Williams at wide receiver, right? We know he is going to be the wide receiver one for the Illini. But interesting question at running back now, where Chase Brown has moved on, and we've got Josh McCray and Reggie Love battling for carries now. Is this potentially a backfield in 2023? Or could we potentially see a running back one emerge and get that heavy volume like we saw last year with either one of those guys? I know right now I'm more so on the Josh McCray train than Reggie Love, but, I see there's some guys that are on both sides of the coin right now.
Yeah, I think both, a committee approach, which the coaching staff talked about in the spring, all throughout the spring. I mean, I was just reading up, like the coaching staff legitimately said that they wish they could have given Chase Brown less carries last year. So that's kind of it. Maybe it's coach speak that their preference is to give, the split up the carries between two rushers. But, you look at Barry Lunny, the offensive coordinator, and his time last year at Illinois and then previously at UTSA, and he feeds his running back one more than probably 125 coaches in college football. So it's kind of a coach speak versus track record of the coaching staff ordeal here. So I think this is one that we absolutely have to pay attention to in fall camp. I did find an interesting stat too with Brett Bielema. I was reading up. He has had more seasons in his coaching career of 2 1,000-yard rushers in a season than not having a single 1,000-yard rusher in a season. So, hey, if the offensive line is really good, there's probably a better chance that Reggie Love and Josh both hit 1,000 yards than having one this season. So definitely one that we'll pay attention to in fall camp.
What about the passing game? Tommy DeVito last year threw 15 touchdowns, only 4 interceptions in that offense. Very efficient for them. They're bringing in Luke Altmaier from Ole Miss. Should he be on a fantasy radar right now? More of a wait and see approach. I know for me, I'm not really interested in him, but I think it all depends on the format of your league right now.
No, I'm not interested in him at all as a fantasy option. The one thing that we need from Luke Altmaier is that he's as serviceable as Tommy DeVito was last year to aid Isaiah Williams and the passing game, right? Because that's the guy we're interested in. So we just need him to be as good as Tommy DeVito was last year, or as average as Tommy DeVito was last year, to help support Isaiah Williams.
Yep. Well, look, Mike, let's go over to Indiana. And I think when we're looking at fantasy assets on that Indiana roster right now, I think you start and stop at this moment with Cam Camper, wide receiver. Beginning of last year, he may have been at the top of the list of targets per game in the country, maybe through 2 or 3 games. I forget what the stat was, ran into some injury problems. But, there you've got a situation at running back where you've got Josh Henderson. You've got a player like Jalen Lucas. A lot of unknowns, even at quarterback for Indiana. But Cam Camper right now kind of seems to be the starting and the stopping point for me as far as fantasy appeal on that Hoosiers roster. What about for yourself?
Yeah, I think so. He was, God, it might have been until his injury that he was leading the country in targets, definitely through the first 4 games, right? It was like 15 targets, then it was 11, and then 15, and then 19 targets in a game before they hit conference play. And then he had 3 games in Big Ten play where, it was decent production that Cam Camper had, but it was significantly less than what those through the non-conference schedule. So if he falls later in drafts, that's where I'm interested in Cam Camper. But you got 2 issues. One, you're breaking in a new starting quarterback, which, you're replacing Connor Bazelak. So it's not, you're not asking too much of your new starter for what he needs to replace. The other, they do have increased depth though now at the wide receiver position. EJ Williams coming in from Clemson. DeCuse Carter, I believe I'm saying his name right, is a FCS transfer coming in. So he had 1,000 yards and 13 touchdowns last year at Fordham. So he could be involved in the mix. And then a guy that maybe we'll talk about in the backfield, Jalen Lucas, who I know you like, sophomore running back, a more offensive weapon that they used as a freshman last year. He's, I guess, told the coaching staff that he wants to kind of be utilized more as a receiver this year. So he could factor into the mix as well. So breaking in a new starting quarterback plus the new options at receiver. So I like Cam Camper, but, just coming off injury too, there's a lot of, I don't want to say red flags, but there's a lot of reasons to where he doesn't live up to last year's, hype.
Yeah. Well, let's look at Iowa, Mike. And when we're talking Iowa, there's 2 areas, 2 positions that we're always going to look at: running back and tight end. At running back this year, we got Caleb Johnson coming back, led the team in rushing last year, nearly 800 yards, 3 100-yard games. And at tight end, we've got Luke Lachey. Those 2 guys right now from a fantasy perspective. And here's where I'm going with the running back spot. So let's start there with Caleb Johnson. Tyler Goodson ran for 1,000 yards 2 years ago with Iowa. Surprisingly, for the last 5 years, Iowa has not had a running back get over the 800-yard mark. Last year, Caleb Johnson finished at 779. Do you think that we potentially could be leaning more closer to that type of season again in the Iowa backfield? Or does Caleb Johnson, does he have it? Does his offense have it in him to get over that 1,000-yard mark for a running back this year? I am leaning that we may see the 1,000-yard plateau broken by Caleb Johnson this year if I had to put money on it. But like I said, for the last 5 years, sub 800 years for an Iowa running back. Where do you land?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think he hits the 1,000-yard mark. Surprisingly, Iowa running backs, they've hit the 1,000-yard mark, but they don't get to like that 1,300-yard mark for whatever reason. They usually have depth at the running back position, so they kind of tend to split it up a little bit. So I think he hits 1,000 yards. The issue has been the offensive line. As you want to think that Iowa's is like a staple of producing good offensive line play, but last year they brought back 4 starters who were absolutely terrible. I think Iowa finished with the 11th fewest fantasy points generated from their running backs last year, to go with that anemic passing game. So that's obviously why Iowa was so last year. But I think they'll you bring back multiple starters along the offensive line. Caleb Johnson as a sophomore, we both really like. We're not investing too much in the passing game outside from the tight ends, but I do think it's going to be better with Cade McNamara leading the offense. It's hard not to be improved from last year. But I think he's a really good leader, a really good locker room guy. And I think he'll just be, again, serviceable enough to kind of get to that, what do they need to hit this year? I forget what that is. So it's built into Ferentz's contract. It's like they got to hit, I don't know, 24 points per game, something like that. I forget that number, but I think they'll be improved this year. And I think that'll lead to a 1,000-yard season from Caleb Johnson.
A running back at Iowa hasn't hit double-digit touchdowns since Akram Wadley in 2017 when he had 10. Can Caleb Johnson get to that number as well? And I think, and the reason why we're asking these questions is, you know, as well as I, in that Iowa offense, we know that running back one is going to get a significant amount of carries. The 1,000-yard mark, double-digit touchdown, kind of has to be those plateaus if you're going to be selecting these guys in the top half of drafts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other position that we want to look at is tight end with Luke Lachey and Eric All. I think we're both comfortable still having Luke Lachey as tight end one there. Would it surprise us at all if Eric All was tight end one there? He is really good friends with Cade McNamara, so they obviously have a rapport coming into the situation. I think it's a decent option to stack these two players on your fantasy roster, because let's be honest, like, they're not going to force feed any one wide receiver on their roster. I mean, you know, I was looking back, maybe, last two seasons, tight end one has had 80 plus targets. I mean, Noah Fant, I think in 2018 had around 60 targets as a tight end two. So it is feasible that the two leading target getters are the two tight ends. I could see that easily happening this year with Lachey and All.
Yeah, no doubt. Look, 5 of the last 6 years, a tight end has been one of the top 2 receivers in that Iowa offense. And in 2 of the last 4 years, 2 tight ends have actually led the team in receiving. So 2 of the last 4 years, the leading receivers, the 1-2 guys in that offense, have been tight ends. Now, Mike, let's go over to Maryland, where we get a new offensive coordinator. Josh Gaddis comes in, and even Kevin Sumlin as well. I think they're going to be some co-OC over there. We get some known commodities back in quarterback Tuala Tagovailoa. We've got Roman Hembry coming back at running back as well. You know, you've got tight end Corey Dyches there. They bring in the transfer receiver Tyrese Chambers. There's a lot to look at Maryland, but there is a little bit of change in OC. Does that affect the numbers, you think, in that offense this year for Maryland, and maybe even for a player like Roman Hembry at running back, who is coming off of a really good year, and they have, you know, some good pieces to build off of in this offense?
I don't think so, just because Mike Locksley has been an offensive coordinator in the past. Like, I think this is primarily his offense that they're running, and he's just bringing in more voices in the room. And so they added Kevin Sumlin, and then Josh Gaddis, the former Michigan and Miami offensive coordinator. It sounds like it's going to be a kind of joint operation. How that plays out, I don't know. I mean, I call them very mediocre coaches, in my opinion. That's what Maryland's been in the Big Ten since they joined them. Very mediocre. Josh Gaddis, you know, you can make the argument that it was Jim Harbaugh's offense when he won the Broyles Award as the top offensive coordinator. So I don't know how much his offense changes. I think you would agree we both like the talent at quarterback and then some of the skill positions. Where do you focus on, or who have you been drafting most?
Well, for me right now, it would be Roman Hembry at running back. Look, you know, when we look at Maryland receiving over the last 3 years, we've either had Raheem Jarrett or Dante Demas, where we've fallen back on either one of those guys. They're all gone now. You've got Caden Prather they brought in at receiver. They brought in Tyrese Chambers, a transfer as well. From a receiving standpoint, I almost feel like the safer option for me is, if you're looking tight end, go with Corey Dyches. He cut 39 passes, 3 touchdowns last year. CJ Dippre transferred out to Alabama, so he's going to be that tight end one in that offense. And if there's still some heavy focus on the tight end in the passing game this year, I think Hembry and Dyches are going to be the 2 guys that I'm looking at in fantasy drafts.
I would agree. I'm surprised more people aren't on Corey Dyches. I mean, he's a former receiver turned tight end, had 53 targets last year. They lose 39 targets at the tight end position with Dippre going to Alabama. So he's an athletic player playing the tight end position. And we talked about the coaches. If Josh Gaddis has more of a say in this offense, I mean, he utilized the tight end position heavily at Michigan and Miami. So I do like him most. Wide receivers, I think it's a talented group. I just know there's no standout for me, right? I think Tyrese Chambers is going to be good. Caden Prather, who is the wide receiver one coming out of camp, he is going to be solid. So I think it's a good collection of options, just no standout going to be fed 60, 70 receptions this year. I think you would agree with this too. The thing we like most about mostly the quarterback position with Talia Tagovailoa, but at times with the running back too, the Maryland offense is very predictable in terms of you want to start Talia in those non-conference games.
Yes.
And then they can kind of fall by the wayside once they get into Big Ten play because they primarily struggled against the top half of the Big Ten. So I think they're good redraft candidates because you know what you're going to get from these guys against lesser opponents, and then you can just sit them or drop them once they play the Ohio States and Michigans of the world.
Great point. Redraft leagues, Maryland's guys that you typically want to target, they've usually got a softer non-conference slate. And to your point, in the redraft leagues as well, if they, the first 3 or 4 games in, if they put up some really good numbers, you'll have some flexibility to either move on or either leverage those type of guys in some sort of early season trades.
We say that with trades, but I feel like you could probably only pull that off against like newbie college fantasy guys, because I feel like we've talked about this for 3 years now that Maryland just
could
away.
but yeah. Look, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, you got to realize not everybody that we're talking to are seasoned veteran college fantasy football players, right? Yeah. So there are some guys that are going to be starting some new leagues. At least that's what we want, right? So yeah. I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's true. It will happen from time to time.
Yeah, if you got a newbie in your league, sell off Talia after the non-conference schedule to him for a king's ransom.
All right, Mike, fun time. Michigan, Wolverines, stacked lineup, up and down. I mean, we can go on naming them, the offense, look, college football playoff the last couple of years, right? What you see from Michigan is what you're going to get. We know we're going to get a steady dose of that running game. J.J. McCarthy probably is only going to get better as a quarterback. Cornelius Johnson, Roman Wilson, 2 viable tight ends, 2 viable running backs in that offense. But let's talk college fantasy football. And I think for me, and I'll go ahead and start this off because I'll let you finish this conversation. Blake Corum was a guy that I really liked last year, but we both thought that there was room for 2 really good running backs in this offense. And Donovan Edwards didn't particularly put up those big numbers during the year that we thought that he was. Now, he was banged up, and we get that. But then Corum gets hurt at the end of last year, and Edwards comes in and just fills the shoes beautifully. And with Corum coming back from an injury, I feel like my gut feeling tells me that what we thought last year was going to happen, we may have been 1 year ahead of ourselves. We may see that more this year. And if so, I wonder if I have Blake Corum ranked a little bit higher than where I think he should be. And Donovan Edwards might be a little bit lower than I think he ends up. What are your thoughts on this running back? Let's start there at running back.
Yeah, so I could see where we might have Blake Corum ranked a little too highly, but that running game is going to be so dominant again this year that he's got such a high floor that he's going to give you at least a touchdown. I feel like every single week, Blake Corum. So he's just such a safe running back at this point, which just playing behind that offensive line, they're going to be dominant again. You got 3 starters back. You brought in multiple transfers. Like, they are going to be a top 2 unit in college football again. So I think Blake Corum just gives you such a high floor that you just kind of draft him, especially in redraft, right, where you want consistency, and you can just forget about it. He's going to get you a touchdown every week. Donovan Edwards is tough because, yeah, he had the injury last year, but they talked about it in the preseason, right? That they're going to feature him in the passing game, and that it didn't really transpire, right? And that's my concern with Donovan Edwards and JJ McCarthy a little bit, which we'll get into, is that you're getting the players talking about it, that they're gonna throw the ball more this year. You're gonna get Donovan Edwards featured in the slot a little bit more this year, and JJ McCarthy's gonna sling it around and maybe run it a little bit more this year. But like, they said kind of the same things last year and it didn't transpire, right? So is it just coach speak, just getting, some preseason hype, and is it actually going to play out in the regular season, or is Harbaugh going to go back to his ways of just ground and pound and just dominate opponents? So, I think there's some upside there, especially with Edwards. They don't have a lot of I'm surprised they didn't add a receiver in the transfer portal personally, because Roman Wilson's fine. Cornelius Johnson's fine. Can you name their wide receiver 3 at this point? I mean, it's going to be Tyler Morris, but that's a first year or second year
really
player.
Is that significant, knowing the tight end's going to be heavily involved as well?
But so I guess that speaks to my point, is that you don't know their wide receiver 3. They're going to get 2 tight ends on the field. They're going to get Donovan Edwards featured more in the slot. So I can see the path to higher production from Donovan Edwards because of the lack of options at receiver. So I think we have them projected fairly accurately this year with Donovan Edwards, a top 30 option because of his receiving ability. We have Corum top 5. I can see him finishing top, maybe not top 5, but top 10, just because, you're going to get multiple running backs featured. But I think JJ McCarthy is definitely the interesting conversation topic. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. There's some that are, propaganda out there that he could be a top 20, top 30 quarterback. Do you see a path for that?
Here's the problem. You were telling me that there were people out there saying this about Quinn Ewers last year. And I was like, who the heck's saying this stuff? And I don't see that. Like JJ McCarthy, look, there's a difference between being a good NFL prospect and good quarterback than being a good college fantasy football quarterback. These glasses only see through one lens, college fantasy football. So I can recognize a good quarterback when I see one, and McCarthy is one. But I look at it from a college fantasy football angle, and what I see JJ McCarthy rushing for a touchdown in 4 of the last 6 games in which he played last year. Now, if that continues into 2023, then you have a really good quarterback 2 in college fantasy football leagues that require 2 starting quarterbacks. But in a single quarterback league, to me, he's not going to give you enough as some of these other runners from a yardage standpoint. You got to remember, 60 yards rushing is equivalent to a touchdown. I don't necessarily think McCarthy's going to give you 60 yards a game on the ground. But to your point, Michigan's offense is going to be so dominant. How much is he really going to have to put the offense on his shoulders? And the reason why I would argue he scored a rushing touchdown in 4 of the last 6 games of the year is Michigan was all of a sudden in a position to play for the Big Ten title and a national championship. So you lay it out all on the line and you give it everything once when you're 8-9 games into the season. But you look at his rushing numbers from the beginning of the year. He only had 1 rushing touchdown through the first, 8 games of the year.
They didn't need him.
They didn't necessarily need him. And will they need him much this year? That's the question. So to answer your point and be a little long-winded about it, is I'm a pass on JJ McCarthy because I just feel like there's other quarterbacks that for me have a much greater upside at the value down there. Now, you're probably getting JJ McCarthy very cheap in drafts as well. Where I come off on the Michigan whole value standpoint, and where I mentioned it with Edwards, is I do like Edwards a lot. And I like him so much that if I had an early first round pick and I wanted to go running back in full FBS leagues, I'm going Rasheen Ali or Quinshad Judkins, and I'm passing on Corum and hoping to get Donovan Edwards a couple or a few rounds later. That's where I stand on the Michigan running back spot. To your point, though, it almost feels like Corum's going to be safe for a touchdown every single week, though.
Yeah, and that's a Yeah, you could draft Corum, you could draft Edwards, but you would agree you could draft them together, and I think you'll get pretty good production each week.
I think they're both going to go over 1,000 yards on the ground this year. That's my prediction in the Michigan backfield. I think the whole question comes in who gets the majority of touchdowns. I would argue that it's going to be Corum, and I would argue that Edwards is going to give you more points as a receiver out of the backfield.
They're definitely going to want to showcase Edwards because he's made it. I think he's made it known at this point that he wants to leave for the NFL draft after this year. So to continue that conversation a little bit, Benjamin Hall, Cole Cabana, 2 incoming freshmen, I think should be prioritized in dynasty drafts with Corum and Edwards likely leaving after this season. I wanted to quickly put a bow on JJ McCarthy. I don't foresee him I don't see him taking a Bo Nix type jump, right? A QB outside the top 100 last year that finishes top 5, but I think top 30 is a reasonable expectation. He put on 15 to 20 pounds this offseason, so he should be better suited to run the football if needed. I think the other thing that's going to help, they made a change at offensive coordinator, promoting one of their co-OCs last year, Sherrone Moore, to full-time offensive coordinator. I think that should help because the guy that they let go of was in charge of the red zone packages and inside the 5-yard line, which we saw against TCU, right? And putting a freaking fullback in, he carrying the ball inside the 1 who ended up fumbling against TCU. Nice to rehash bad memories. But there's going to be a new play caller with those types of packages inside the red zone there. So I think, which Michigan struggled all of last year, even in the non-conference at scoring inside the 5. So I think that's going to lead to even more scoring opportunities, which benefits McCarthy, Corum, and everybody else involved.
Yep. Now, Michigan State, Mike, they may have a tough time scoring this year. Things have kind of fallen apart on them, and that might be actually being a little generous. They lose Keon Coleman in the transfer portal to Florida State. They lose quarterback Peyton Thorne to Auburn in the transfer portal. When you look at that running back situation there, they've got Nathan Carter, they've got Jalen Berger, Trey Mosley. Probably now you're looking at it, they're wide receiver 1, but questions for me up and down that lineup right now for the Spartans.
Hate to see it.
But for me, it's, this is one of those situations where everything's a pass for me. Mosley may be more of a late flyer receiver pick in deep drafts, but it may be more of a wait and see until the season starts and more of your traditional redraft formats where you might have to see if a player or 2 pops and then go get them on the waiver wire with Michigan State. Sound pretty accurate?
Very accurate. Yeah, we don't have a quarterback, running back, or wide receiver, ranked inside the top 100 in our fantasy rankings, or at least I don't. I don't think you do as well. So no, it's going to be a wait and see if somebody pops during the regular season on the waiver wire report. Maybe a Trey Mosley, but I think he's just like a complimentary wide receiver 2 type player. So I don't think he's like a Keon Coleman or a Jaden Reed type. Running back, no interest. I like the group's decent, right? They brought in Nathan Carter from Connecticut, brought in Jaron Mangum from South Florida to join Jalen Berger. I think collectively they could be okay, but if nobody's going to give you Kenneth Walker like production, that was an aberration. So we're out at the skill positions. I think tight end people like Malik Carr as a plus athlete, but this offensive coordinator hasn't produced a tight end to post over 7 fantasy points per game in a season. So we're out and just see what happens on the waiver wire.
If I had to jump on one wide receiver and I had to put my money on one, I think I would go with Jaron Mangum. But here's the problem that I see.
He's a running back.
What's that?
Mangum's a running back.
Yeah. If I had to put my money on a running back in the Michigan State backfield, I'd put it on him. But here's the problem, to the point we were mentioning when we were jumping off on Michigan State. If they get to a situation where they're going to ride the hot hand, I don't know if anyone's ever going to get hot, because I just really think that they're going to struggle. So you may see a rotation through that backfield most of the year. You may get one guy that pops for a couple of weeks, but I have a hard time seeing any long-term consistent production, fantasy-wise, or just regular production from this Michigan State offense.
I agree. Just a quick note on that. They do get 4 starters back along the offensive line. And if somebody emerges out of fall camp, they face Central Michigan and Richmond coming out of the gate. So maybe there's an opportunity as a spot start if you're absolutely desperate those first 2 weeks.
But you'd have to be willing to roll the dice too.
Yep.
There you go. Well, let's head over to Minnesota, where I'll go ahead on record and say this. I really like their roster. I like what they're doing. I think they're going to be a little bit more diverse this year on offense. They bring in Sean Tyler at running back. They've got Zach Evans that's been there with the program as well. There's some debate on who's going to be running back 1. We'll get into that discussion. You've got quarterback Ethan, and I don't want to butcher his name, but I have a feeling I should know this name because I think we're going to be talking about him a little bit more, but maybe Kaliakmanis.
Yep.
There you go, Ethan Kaliakmanis. I really like his ability to move around a little bit, and they've got some targets for him. They bring in Elijah Spencer. They've brought in Corey Crooms. They already have Daniel Jackson there, Brevin Spanford at tight end, Chris Ottman-Bell. There's a lot there on this offense to build around. They just got to put the pieces together.
I think they have the pieces. They like their quarterback, Ethan Kaliakmanis. They call him the Greek gunslinger. So they like him. I think he'll be a definite improvement over, Tanner Morgan the last few seasons. But you kind of spoke to it. I think we're going to see a stylistic shift in the offense. The last 2 seasons they had Mo Ibrahim they had Mo Ibrahim last year, and they were running the ball they were passing the ball just 30% of the time in the last 2 seasons. I think we're going to see it get close to 40% this season, reminiscent of those Western Michigan days back with PJ Fleck. So I think the offense is he's morphing it more towards what he had at Western Michigan. So while that's good for, I think, the offense as a whole, I don't know that I'm personally, maybe you're different. I'm not interested really in this passing game from a fantasy perspective because I don't think they're going to throw the ball enough to have a featured wide receiver or tight end. I mean, Brevin Spanford, very good tight end, but you add in Elijah Spencer, like you said, Corey Crooms from Western Michigan, bring back Daniel Jackson. There's a lot of talented pass catchers now that I think the ball's going to get spread out a little bit and nobody's going to be fantasy relevant. I think it's just gonna be better for offense as a whole.
Yeah, well, you and I were kind of going back and forth on running back 1. I really like Sean Tyler. He's shown the ability that when he was at Western Michigan that he can carry the ball a lot in the game. Now, doing it in the Big Ten and doing it in the MAC is a big difference. And then there'll be some that say that Zach Evans maybe the guy that emerges as well, right? I'm gonna say this now while we're recording this, but I think that quarterback is a sleeper. There's just something about him. He's 210 pounds. He's bigger than both Sean Tyler and Zach Evans. I would not be surprised if he gets his number called around the goal line a little bit more often. And we just talked about whether or not we thought, JJ McCarthy and his fantasy appeal over at Michigan. I think this quarterback, Ethan Kaliakmanis Manis over at Minnesota, I think he has potential to be a sleeper quarterback in this conference. How about that, Mike?
Yeah, I'm looking it up right now. So, yeah, I was kind of looking at that too, where he's definitely going to be better than Tanner Morgan. We would agree. If we think it's going to be reminiscent of the Western Michigan offense, they had, you remember this name, Zach Terrell, their quarterback. So he ran the ball. I'm just looking now. He had 13 touchdowns in 3 seasons rushing the football. Looks like he averaged over 23 fantasy points per game in all 3 seasons as a starter, which speaks to your point. That's probably 23 fantasy points. That's a top 70 quarterback in CFF. So no, yeah. I it's not out of the question that he could be.
Yeah, Kaliakmanis, 6'4", 210. Even if he puts on a few pounds, maybe a 215 quarterback by the time they line up in the fall. I'm just saying, I've got my eyes on that kid. I really like him this year. I with what they're giving him and put around him, I think there's going to be some potential, fantasy potential in that quarterback this year.
So for maybe our newer college fantasy players, we would both agree and advise you are definitely not going to see Mo Ibrahim like carries from any of the running backs, right?
For as much as I would like to say yes, I don't think we have that guy right now. And even if that were to happen, we talk about this every year. I would think that Sean Tyler, Zach Evans are going to be a 1-2 punch. If one of those guys goes down with an injury, you're then looking at a guy that's probably going to get 20 carries a game. But I think right now you're going to see a good mixture. Probably somebody gets around 15 carries a game, somebody gets 12, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Kelly McManus get somewhere between 6 to 8 carries a game.
Yeah, if we're comparing it to Western Michigan, Jarvian Franklin, Jamari Bogan, remember those guys? Yeah. I mean, they split it up, and both of them had close to 1,000 yards, if not both surpassed it too. So I think we see something reminiscent of that this year.
Yep. Let's head over to Nebraska. The Matt Rule era has begun at Nebraska to try to restore some tradition over there, right? Brings in Marcus Satterfield offensive coordinator, who comes in from South Carolina. To me, very just an awe-inspiring, hire. Just to me, doesn't really raise my socks, but proved pretty efficient last year as a play caller at South Carolina. But when you look at Nebraska right now, Mike, and it was something that you and I have talked about, you've got Jeff Sims at quarterback, came in as a really, high potential at Georgia Tech. Will he fulfill that at Nebraska? Remains to be seen. Anthony Grant looked really good at times last year at Nebraska, but you've got a new coaching staff. Will it be him? Will it be Gabe Ervin? They bring in a transfer in Billy Kemp from Virginia at receiver. You've got some other guys, Marcus Washington there, but nothing really jumps out at me when it comes to Nebraska. I almost feel like this is kind of a wait and see. If I'm taking a flyer on one guy right now, it may be really late, Jeff Sims, if I already have my quarterbacks and I'm looking to take a stab at some depth just because of his dual threat ability.
Yeah, I would agree. Maybe they surprise, but I can't see Nebraska jumping right out of the gate and having a ton of success in a tough Big Ten conference this year. So, not investing too much in Nebraska players from a college fantasy standpoint. I think Jeff Sims is definitely the most intriguing because he's a dual threat quarterback, and we love dual threat quarterbacks in college fantasy. I was looking back Matt Rule's time at Baylor, when actually I didn't even realize this at the time, Marcus Satterfield was on the staff there at Baylor for 2 of those years as the tight end coach. They had Charlie Brewer as their starting quarterback, and they ran the hell out of him, which, didn't end up so well for Charlie Brewer, right, because he had head issues. But he ran the ball 133 times in 2018, 147 times in 2019. So you get 4-5 athlete like Jeff Sims running the ball 100 plus times. Now you're talking about a quarterback that can be very relevant in college fantasy. So probably will like him most in those. Here, let's bring up the Nebraska schedule just so I don't talk out of my behind.
Well, while you're looking up that real quick, the one thing that I will say is I just think when you look at Matt Rule and what they want to try to establish, I'd like to think that running back will eventually become an option for us as the year goes on. I just don't know whether or not it's going to be Ervin or Grant right now. And for me, I think one of those guys has potential in redraft leagues to be on a fantasy roster come week 3, 4, and possibly down the line.
I would personally disagree with that, but I can see it. And kind of speaking to our previous point, if somebody does emerge in fall camp, their non-conference schedule is fun from the perspective of you're facing competitive teams, but not necessarily you're not going to see the bench warmers against some FCS opponents. They get Minnesota at Minnesota right out of the gate. You're not starting anybody in that matchup. But after that, at Colorado, we might play a Jeff Sims or whoever's the starting running back, then NIU, and then Louisiana Tech.
Right.
So
3 good games.
And
Yeah.
3 good games could be potentially competitive to where they're playing all 4 quarters. I think Jeff Sims is a very, very viable option there, and then maybe the running back coming out of there. But Jeff Sims for me, I think is it, and then maybe Billy Kemp in full point PPR formats, because he's not, he's a 5'10" slot receiver, right? So he's not going to be a jump ball specialist in the red zone or anything. So PPR guy, maybe Billy Kemp, but Jeff Sims first and foremost.
Now at Northwestern, Mike, here's one thing that we try to do when we do these shows is we try to, the one thing we do is we keep our fingers crossed and hopeful that this material that we record now stays relevant over the next month and a half through preseason camp. That may be tough to do talking about Northwestern, where head coach Pat Fitzgerald is kind of under the microscope right now for some incidents that happened over there. I don't know the details of it, so I'm not going to go into the details. But let's just look at it through some college fantasy football lens. Whether or not Pat Fitzgerald is there and whether or not he's going to be the coach when this even airs remains to be seen. The one thing that we do know is that there is if you're going to invest from a fantasy standpoint in a player on the Northwestern roster under Pat Fitzgerald, it's typically going to be that running back 1 spot, right? Where this year we've got Cam Porter pegged into that spot. They brought in Ben Bryant, the transfer from Cincinnati. There's not a lot on this roster that you or I are even looking at from a fantasy standpoint anyway. Cam Porter would probably be it. With or without Pat Fitzgerald, that might be the only option we're really looking at or even considering in fantasy drafts between now and the next 45 days anyway, right?
Yeah, unless Northwestern just made some drastic hire if they fired Pat Fitzgerald and they went air raid for some, that's completely hypothetical, but it probably wouldn't happen anyway. So I think the conversation starts and ends here with Cam Porter. Just twice in the last 9 years has the running back 1 for Northwestern failed to hit 13 fantasy points per game. So it's been a fairly, not necessarily high upside, but a very consistent position in college fantasy football. So, you're getting usually 40% volume share too. So Northwestern typically does feed 1 running back as well. So again, it starts and ends with Cam Porter, and we'll see what transpires with the coaching situation and as the weeks go on here in the summer.
Now, Ohio State, there's a lot to talk about, much like Michigan, except maybe this offense is probably it's going to be more explosive through the air and almost just as explosive probably on the ground, right? I think really the biggest question at Ohio State is who's going to be starting at quarterback. At running back, you got Travion Henderson, Mayan Williams. We're going to revisit that when we get into the positions. You've got Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka at receiver. We can just start there because those 2 guys are probably going in the top 5 at their position in college fantasy football drafts. You've got some options there at wide receiver 3 that we can get into. But let's start at quarterback, Mike, because you and I, we've got Kyle McCord pegged there as the starter. Everybody that's going to be drafting this year is just going to want to know, look, we've seen the other players. We don't know what Kyle McCord can do. What's his upside? What's his ceiling? Maybe what's his floor from a fantasy standpoint? I think pretty safely you and I think McCord as a top 25. I'm not checking the rankings right now, but somewhere right around that 25 range. Feels safe to you?
Yeah, it's that was my bullet point with Kyle McCord here, is that when I started drafts back in February, he was going as QB 11 in drafts, and initially I was just like, that's way too high, right? Because CJ Stroud threw 41 touchdowns and he didn't even finish top 20 last year in college fantasy. So since February, current June ADP, he's now QB 20 and with our data. So he's fallen back to a range where I would be comfortable selecting him, and I think where he should go properly in drafts. It's just, you're going to get we haven't seen Kyle McCord for play for an extended season. but we can safely peg him for 30 touchdowns. That's just what Ohio State quarterbacks does. The issue is that because he is going to run for 0 yards or negative yards and probably not have a rushing touchdown, because CJ Stroud didn't have a rushing touchdown the last 2 years, he needs to throw for 40 touchdowns for him to be, a top 15, top 10 quarterback. So he's going now where we feel comfortable as a QB 20 range. Where do you want to go next?
I know. I get it. No, currently in the latest update that we have, I have them at 22. Yep. You have them at 24, puts them as a top 25. I don't think we're overreaching for them, but the potential is there. But to your point, without the dual threat ability, it has to be, right place, right time in a draft for us. Let's go over to receiver. I feel like that one's a little bit more clear cut. Marvin Harrison Jr. pretty much is, I think, the consensus number one fantasy wide receiver in general, probably in college football. Emeka Egbuka as well is, a top 5 fantasy receiver as well. You've got 2 teams that probably have 2 fantasy receivers in the top 10, Ohio State and Washington. We'll get to the Huskies when we cover the Pac-12. Maybe, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on as far as wide receiver 1 or 2, but what about a third option? Because there could be a third option. I think if we had a more proven quarterback, we'd be a little bit more bullish on a third wide receiver. But right now, the argument is it Julian Fleming, or do they get some of these younger guys involved?
Yeah. So that was a big conversation last year when we were doing the projections and the preseason fantasy guide. Were we going to see, heavy target share with just 2 receivers like we've seen in the past, with like a Chris Olave and a Garrett Wilson dominating that target share, or was it going to be spread out amongst the top 3? And what we saw was Harrison and Egbuka dominating the targets for the most part last year. And I think we see the same thing this year. Fleming will likely be the wide receiver 3 and third starter, but I mean, he's been injured in the past, inconsistent play. I think, I can see that being a scenario where we see one of those freshmen step into that third role. So for me, it's just Harrison and Egbuka, and kind of, I think that's going to be the highest percentage targets here for the Buckeyes there.
Yep. Now at running back, could almost feel like the Michigan backfield, where we've got Trevion Henderson, who 2 years ago was unreal, right? Mayan Williams stepped in last year when Henderson was hurt and was really good. The Buckeyes couldn't seem to get both of these guys on the field at the same time, but to their credit, their depth and they at least got one of them on the field almost every week actually helped their offense. But if we go into the season with both guys healthy, what are we looking at now? And I know I was on the fence really in spring talking about this, where I was like, Mayan Williams to me just seems like the tougher back, seems like the guy that's just gritty. I really like that, and his ability to kind of just stick in there. And I think he's going to get, his share of fantasy points. But I'm also now seeing the other side of the fence as well, where Trevion Henderson really is just the more talented of the 2 backs. And if he really gets that engine fired up this year, I can really see them, putting the offense on his back, particularly maybe early in the year while they're getting McCord acclimated to being the everyday starter. So I can see both sides of the coin. I'm really stuck on this one, but right now, earlier in the spring, I was like, if I'm going to take a stab, maybe Mayan Williams, but no, I'm completely back on the Trevion Henderson train, I think, which is where you were at right now, right?
Yeah, I'm interested to, I guess we haven't talked about it. I'm just interested to hear you say that, because I remember when we were initially doing the projections for Ohio State, we were on different sides of the coin there. For me, it just comes down to pure talent. Like I just think that Trevion Henderson is the better back of the 2. Health was obviously a huge reason as to why Trevion Henderson didn't succeed last season. You can debate toughness if you want, but it was health is the primary reason as to why he didn't succeed. You look at the first four of the first 5 games last year, he did have at least 80 yards rushing. So when he was perceived his healthiest, like, he was doing not top 5 where we had him ranked, but he was being productive. So I think you spoke to this as well. Like, you're breaking in a new quarterback. You're definitely going to want to lean on Henderson and the running game, especially to start that year. So, I like Henderson the most of the two backs. We've spoken this with Michigan. We'll probably say it with Penn State. Like, I don't mind stacking the situation, particularly in a best ball either, because Mayan Williams is going 6-7 rounds after Travion Henderson. So, I say
I
draft
think
them both.
The situation is very similar to Michigan. Ohio State is going to be able to dominate enough games that Mayan Williams is going to get enough touches, even as running back too, if that's the way the order shakes out. He's going to get enough touches. He's probably going to get enough scores. There's going to be enough touchdowns to go around for him to be on fantasy rosters this year. And to your point, yeah, go ahead and stack them because, and this was the point we were making with JJ McCarthy over at Michigan. Look, there's going to be some games throughout the year where Michigan and Ohio State, they're probably going to be challenged a couple of times. But make no mistake about it. Michigan and Ohio State, after seeing what happened, particularly last year with Ohio State, the running back position, those guys just need to be healthy for the last 2 weeks of the season. They need to be healthy when they play Michigan, and they need to be healthy for if they win that game to go to the Big Ten championship and the playoffs, we can make that same argument for Michigan. And I think really that's what it's going to come down to. So I don't know if we're going to see Travion Henderson with that 1,800 yard season that we would like to, because I think it's all about keeping these guys healthy, using both of them, and hopefully be in position to play for our national championship at the end of the year.
Yeah. Can we get 1,000 yards out of Travion Henderson this year? 1,100? Like, I think that's a reasonable expectation, especially given the fact that we think that they'll be running the football, especially starting out of the gate.
I could see 1,200 yards and double-digit touchdowns from him, and I could see, where a guy like Mayan runs for 800 yards and gets close to double-digit touchdowns himself, and heck, even the running back 3 might have 500 yards in that offense.
Is the running back situation your biggest question mark heading into the year with Ohio State?
No, my biggest just question is how high of an upside does Kyle McCord actually have? I think I'm settled at running back. I'm settled at receiver. For me, it just comes down to me. Kyle McCord is going to be the ultimate wild card of this offense.
Yeah. I think my biggest question is just, how much will Ohio State lose by to Michigan in the last game of the season?
Wow, you're firing shots.
I had to tee that one up.
All right, now that we've had our fun, let's go over to Penn State, Mike. And this is where, I think we're going to get a fun conversation when it comes to the running back. You look at Penn State, Drew Allure at quarterback. There's some that really like him this year. We'll get into that conversation. The running back situation, seems like this is maybe the fourth school now where we're talking about it. You've got Nick Singleton and Katron Allen there. You've got at receiver coming back. You got Keandre Smith. They bring in Dante Cephas, the transfer from Kent State. Tight end Theo Johnson. Usually Penn State's good for a couple of tight end names every year as well. So a lot to talk about here with Penn State. But from a fantasy standpoint, let's just get right into it. Let's go with running backs because you were very high on Singleton this year. And I feel like, there are a number of guys out there that are really high on him, and there are some where it may be more of a split backfield, but you're high on Singleton this year.
Yeah, and it's tough because I can see both sides of the spectrum here. It's the same argument with Travion. It's just that I believe that Nick Singleton is the better, the more explosive, let's just say, that player than Katron Allen. So I think that'll lead to better fantasy production. But this is a situation too where I've found myself stacking both players together in my best ball drafts because I think that's just what Penn State is going to do this year. I think they're going to be very similar to what Michigan's offense was last year. You're breaking in a first-year starter quarterback. Your best players on offense are your left tackle, who bypassed the NFL draft, and then your 2 running backs, right? So I think they're just going to hammer the run this year. I have some stats for both Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton, which just kind of, I don't know, convolutes the situation. So like Kaytron Allen had he had 167 carries versus 155 for Nick Singleton. So he had the rushing attempt edge. If you look at red zone carries, 30-23 in favor of Kaytron Allen.
They both scored double-digit touchdowns on the ground.
Both scored double-digit touchdowns on the ground. More opportunities for Kaytron Allen, and in the receiving game, Kaytron Allen had 24 targets versus 17 for Nick Singleton. The difference between the two, Nick Singleton 6.8 yards per carry with 12 rushes of 20 yards or more. He had 4.58 yards per attempt after contact, and then he had a 59.9% breakaway rush rate per Pro Football Focus versus just 25.7 for Kaytron Allen. So you can see both sides of the coin with the two running backs, which I think speaks to my point of I am totally in favor of stacking this Penn State running game because I think that's just what they're going to lean on this year.
Yeah, I think you have to. I am not one of those guys that are going up, and I won't have any shares of Nick Singleton this year because I just feel like he's a little too rich for where I have him valued. Because to your point, both of those guys, freshmen last year, Allen had more carries. He had almost twice as many receptions. And what I think Singleton had 13 touchdowns and Allen had 11. So I'm looking at this situation as, do I really think they're going to be that dissimilar this year? And I don't. I think we're going to see maybe a little bit closer to a mirror image again, unless, like we say this, and we don't hope any ill will on anyone. One of those guys gets hurt, all of a sudden
that's a league winner,
15 running back.
That I think that's a league winner, top 5 potentially running
possibly
back, in my opinion, right?
For sure.
So I like stacking that again. Speaking to your point just there, just 3 times last year did either Nick Singleton or Kaytron Allen hit 20 attempts per game. So this could very well be one guy gets 15 carries, the other guy gets 12 in a game, and then they flip flop and it could just be split the entire year. So, but I don't. Do you agree? I think they'll lean on the running game this year. I think breaking in Drew Aller at quarterback.
I completely agree with that. No doubt the running game is going to be the strength of their offense for sure. I do like, and I want to go to tight end next because I'm starting to get a little higher on Theo Johnson than I was in the spring. I just feel like when I look at that roster and I look at the receivers, Keandre Lambert-Smith doesn't really jump off the page. They bring in Dante Cephas, still don't know what we have yet. I saw Theo Johnson making waves in the spring. I think he actually might he might need to kind of go up my list a little bit. I'm wondering if I'm undervaluing him in that Penn State passing game this year. I don't know. It's not like all of a sudden he's an air raid target, but I do like him maybe as a good tight end in tight end formats. If I'm not targeting that backfield, he probably is the next player that I'm looking at in that Penn State offense right now. What about yourself?
I don't have any shares, but I can see the argument. Brenton Strange was a starter last year. He had 32 receptions and 5 touchdowns on 38 targets. They combined
for 52 receptions, the top 2 tight ends last year.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you have vacated production there. That's no longer there. And who's to say he's not the best receiving option on their team because there's major question marks at wide receiver. I think it's a decent group that they have at receiver, but we have no idea how they're exactly going to perform. So, I mean, Theo Johnson could be the most proven option on the team that has the most rapport with Drew Aller. So yeah, I can see a path to success with Theo Johnson.
Well, we got a little spoiled a couple of seasons ago, right? Because Jahan Dotson had 90 catches, almost 1,200 yards, 12 touchdowns. But last year, I mean, Tinsley had 51 catches. Washington had 46. It was more of a spread. It was more spread around last year. You really didn't have that one dominant target. And I think that's what we're going to see a little bit more from this Penn State offense this year. What about Drew Aller? Let's touch on him real quick. For me, I don't really, for fantasy, another conversation of, hey, potentially a really good quarterback. But for me, from fantasy standpoint, I don't see myself really going after Drew Aller.
Nope, me neither. Future top 10 probably NFL draft pick in 2 years, but just from a fantasy perspective, I don't have a lot of interest. The one part that I was looking back, a little interesting to me, their offensive coordinator Mike Yurcich. If you look back at his quarterback production, he had a non-runner in Mason Rudolph back at Oklahoma State, and he actually had 10 rushing touchdowns in the season. We wouldn't consider Mason Rudolph, a big time athlete, right? He's essentially a pocket passer. So, in the similar mold of Drew Aller. So maybe they get Drew Aller some red zone carries like that, and he gets 5 or 6 rushing touchdowns, which impacts dramatically his fantasy outlook. So that would be the path to success in fantasy for me. But outside of that, I think they just stick to running the football with those 2 horses in the backfield.
Over at Purdue, Mike, Graham Harrell comes in as offensive coordinator after Ryan Walters takes over the program with Brom off to Louisville. They bring in Hudson Card, the transfer quarterback. He's going to lead that Graham Harrell offense. You've got a very serviceable, very good running back, at least in Devin Mockabee. He proved to be last year. He's there back. Probably we've got TJ Sheffield right now pegged as that top receiver. They bring in Jamal Edrin as well, transfer receiver. Thoughts on the Purdue offense? Because my initial thought is with Graham Harrell, even at West Virginia last year, I was actually surprised at how well they ran the ball. And I think if they're able to do something similar this year at Purdue, knowing that Graham Harrell's kind of coming from that air raid passing tree, for me, Devin Mockabee might be undervalued from a running back standpoint. He's the one player that I think I'm looking at if I'm drafting a Purdue player right now. And then it would have to be really late to draw a flyer on trying to peg that wide receiver 1 in the passing game.
Yeah, I agree. I think Mockabee is definitely undervalued. I don't know. Is he a boring pick? Is that why he's undervalued? He's going to look, this is an air raid offense. They're going to throw it 58% of the time. So it's not like, they're going to feed their running back, 250 carries. But he's going to get 40 plus targets probably in this system. And so
well,
to
that point though, last year at West Virginia, you had Mathis, Donaldson, and Johnson that were splitting carries. Tell me who's behind there. There's not, as far as the depth chart goes, you've got Mockabee. Who do you have after him? The converted receiver, Tyrone Tracy. I mean, to me, there's nothing behind him. So he's going to get the lion's share of carries when they do run it.
Correct. Yes. He's going to get the lion's share of carries. I guess the flip side to that is they're going to pass it more than they're going to run it. So again, where Maccabee's going, I think he is a tremendous, just solid, rock solid pick. I'm focused on the passing game just because of how much they perceive should throw it this year with Graham Harrell as the new offensive coordinator. They say all the right things about Hudson Card. This is the guy that they prioritized in the transfer portal. This is the guy he was number 1, I think, on their list of quarterbacks to bring in. And he just checked all the boxes for them this spring. So, I like Hudson Card as kind of a QB3, QB4 on your roster. I think there's 2 issues for me when looking at Purdue. One, who's catching the ball or who's catching passes from Hudson Card with, Charlie Jones no longer there. A lot of Corey Gamage was committed to Purdue. Now he's with Central Florida. So we don't know for sure who's the starters at receiver. The other thing, have you checked out their schedule? Purdue, it is not kind to them once they get out of non-conference play. You get Fresno, at Virginia Tech, and Syracuse first 3 games. Could be fun. You get Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Ohio State, and then a bye week. You might not.
That's murderous row right there.
You might not play a single, even Devin Mockabee, might not play a single Purdue player in that 5-game stretch. So could be fun to start the season, but you might, we talked about this earlier in the show, you might want to sell off some pieces after those first 3 games because you're not starting them in that 5-game stretch, anybody from Purdue.
Could if wide receiver one becomes established, knowing that they're going to probably be playing from behind during that stretch, would a player like TJ Sheffield in that wide receiver one spot at least be a decent play, maybe in a PPR option through that stretch, if he indeed is the guy that lands that role?
Potentially, yes, absolutely. Because again, they're going to throw it 58% of the time with Graham Harrell. The trouble is that 6 of the last 7 years, the wide receiver one under Harrell has been an outside receiver. TJ Sheffield only 5'11". So we don't know. I guess it's still up in the air because he's played outside and in the slot the last 2 years. So he could play outside and kind of fit that mold there. I think he fits in the slot. They're going to start Jamal Adrien, the Florida Atlantic transfer. And then I was actually reading about this yesterday. I didn't even realize it. Do you remember the name Elijah Canyon from Auburn?
Auburn.
Yeah. Yep. So I guess he wasn't healthy last season, and maybe effort was a cause too, but he obviously didn't produce much with Purdue last year. Graham Harrell is comping him a little bit, not the same player, but to Drake London as a guy a bigger bodied 6'4" guy, good movement skills and good red zone skills
that could go up and make a play.
A play. You can kind of move him inside and out too. So I don't know. Who knows, right? He hasn't done anything in his career, but throw that name out back on your radar from a couple of years ago. If Graham Harrell sees Drake London in Elijah Canyon, maybe he's a 50-60 catch guy for you.
Over to Rutgers, Mike. Gavin Wimsatt, hopefully, could be improved this year as a quarterback. For me, if I'm looking at any fantasy assets on this Rutgers roster, probably start with Samuel Brown in the backfield at running back. And then maybe Johnny Langham at tight end, but because he's kind of done it all. He's got some carry, rushing touchdowns, receiving touchdowns,
passing. He's got passing touchdowns.
Yep. But I don't really know if I'm willing to go there right now. I think Samuel Brown really, for me, is the only one that sticks out from a fantasy standpoint as far as having any appeal, and even that would be sort of late in drafts for me. Any difference of opinion for Rutgers for yourself?
A little bit, actually. We talked about this pre-show. I was like, hey, I'm updating my rankings. I'm making a big change here. And it's a lot of it's projection at this point, but I'm moving Samuel Brown up my rankings here. I think the biggest question was health. And we didn't get a lot of updates from the coaching staff in the spring. They're giving us coach speak about, hey, he's progressing. He's taking the mental reps, stuff like that. You're just kind of reading the tea leaves. I think the last article that I saw was late April, early May after spring that, Greg Schiano expects him to be ready week 1. And Rutgers made an offensive coordinator change. They hired Kirk Soraka, who was coaching under PJ Fleck at Minnesota. He made some stops to West Virginia and Penn State. Yeah. But you look back, his RB1 has averaged 223 carries per season over the last 9 years. Some of it is, Mo Ibrahim getting 300 freaking carries. But this is a offensive coordinator that has shown time and time again that he loves to feed one running back. Samuel Brown, 220 pounds, sophomore, doesn't have a lot of tread on his tires, right? That's a guy who, assuming he's fully healthy, I think could get 180, 190 carries, be that central piece of the Rutgers offense. Now, it's not going to be a great Rutgers offense, but I don't care. I want guaranteed volume, right? And you're not going to, it's a guy that maybe you don't have to play guesswork and is going to get 15 to 20 carries every single game. So I'm moving Samuel Brown up my rankings here, and it's a guy that I'm going to take shots on because I think, offensive coordinator has shown it. He's going to feed that guy if he has them.
And we've said this on previous shows. We tend to follow the volume.
Yep, absolutely.
Let's jump over to Michigan to wrap up the Big Ten Conference, Mike, where Luke Fickell comes in to take over the program. He brings in Phil Longo from North Carolina as his offensive coordinator. So we know that we're going to get a new look offense from Wisconsin. They bring in Tanner Mordecai, the transfer quarterback from SMU. Braylon Allen is still there. You've got a healthy Chez Mulusi this year. You've got a couple of targets now. We're probably going to be talking about Wisconsin receivers as viable fantasy options now. We've got Will Pauling and Shamir DK as well. I think we know what we're going to get with Braylon Allen. He's still a top 10 preseason fantasy running back, top 10 guy. But let's talk about that offense in general. Let's start at quarterback with Tanner Mordecai. Where do you stand on him? Because I'm a little up in the air on him as a fantasy asset this year. And some of it, I think, might be a little bit of some of his decision-making. But maybe Phil Longo will kind of iron out those wrinkles and bring something out of him that I haven't seen before.
Yeah, maybe you need to speak on this because I'm completely – I have him quarterback 50. So he's not – I was going to say I'm completely out on Tanner Mordecai. So, QE 50, he's not all the way out but I don't know. Did you watch that spring game? Like that was one of the worst performances I have ever seen from a player in a spring game. He was god awful, throwing four picks at least. He might have had more. So I don't see it translating for me personally. Tanner Mordecai, where's the schedule at? I always like to look at this. Well, this is something you do now.
So we could, I think that pretty much sums it up on where we stand with Mordecai. I think your description of him in the spring game performance is kind of the basis for where he's ranked for us. I think the bigger questions to get into as we get into Wisconsin is, look, Phil Longo does have some prior history of rolling out two quality backs and being too productive, producing two backs in an offense, right? So what does that mean? Are you in the train of Braylon Allen getting the lion's share of carries, or do you think that there could be some potential where Chez Mulusi can come in and take some carries away and we see more of a two-back system at Wisconsin this year?
Not once in the last 9 years has a Phil Longo running back one hit 200 carries. So obviously the volume is going to be down for Braylon Allen. But, I know I poo-pooed Tanner Mordecai, but I do think the offense is going to be better than it was under Graham Mertz, right? So I think as a result of that, you're going to see more scoring opportunities for Braylon Allen. So while the volume is going to be down, look, Javonte Williams under Phil Longo at North Carolina had 19 touchdowns back in 2020. Wouldn't shock me at all to see that type of season from a Braylon Allen type, who I think is probably on that level, maybe not on that level, translating to the NFL, but is at the collegiate level as talented as a Javonte Williams. So volume is definitely going to be down. You're going to see Chez Mulusi get more involved, but I think just this offense improving is going to lead to more scoring opportunities for Braylon Allen. And for me personally, he's kind of similar to Blake Corum in that, maybe he doesn't finish top 5, top 10, but I think I think you can probably bank on a touchdown per week from Braylon Allen this year. Is that where you are with Braylon?
Yeah, I look, top 10 running back for me. I think he's going to get the majority of carries in that backfield. I think we're going to see two backs. So I think we're right on point with that. I could see consistency really winning out and that being the difference of why you want Braylon Allen on your roster this year. I think the other question comes in is there a player or receiver on the roster that can produce Josh Downs-like numbers for Phil Longo in the Wisconsin offense that he was able to get out of Downs over there at North Carolina? Is that player on the roster right now at Wisconsin? And is it DK? Is it Pauling? For me, that's probably the next best question that I'm asking going into preseason right now with Wisconsin.
Yeah, I think that's a situation that we really have to stay on top of once fall camps start rolling out. We have Shamir DK as the wide receiver one, and I made this kind of argument for DK is if you can score 50 fantasy points in a game with Graham Mertz as your quarterback, I think you're a pretty good receiver, right? So we have DK as the top option right now for Wisconsin. The problem is that 5 of the last 6 years under Phil Longo, it's been the slot receiver that's ended up as the wide receiver 1. So Cincinnati transfer Will Pauling emerged out of the spring as the starter in the slot. I personally haven't seen him play football. So if we keep hearing that upward trajectory for Pauling, that could be a situation where he, maybe we flip flop our rankings and Pauling becomes the wide receiver 1 for in our projections as opposed to DK. So
yeah, and that's a good point. And the counterpoint I think we'll make to that is just that DK is probably of the two. When you compare him and Antoine Green, which is who Longo had at North Carolina, I would argue, like to your point, given that DK posted those numbers with the previous quarterbacks, probably the better wide receiver 2 option that Longo has had in a while. So
yeah, absolutely. And just kind of put a button on that one. I said completely out on Tanner Mordecai personally, but you look at the non-conference schedule, you get Buffalo right out of the gate, at Washington State, and then Georgia Southern, which actually could be a fun game, maybe high scoring. So I can see starting Tanner Mordecai in at least 2 of those 3 games, maybe all 3. So, but do you have confidence in Tanner Mordecai? I'm looking down the line. He gets Iowa, at Illinois, and then Ohio State in a 3-game stretch in October. You're not starting him in any of those 3 games. So he's going to be hit or miss if depending on when you start him in your lineups.
Well, look, it's Big Ten football. It's Big Ten defense. You got to pick and choose your spots with your players sometimes. And so that's, that goes into whether, brings the whole format equation into play. You've got some good matchups. You get some bad matchups, good for best ball, good and bad for redrafts. You got to pick your poison, but I wouldn't, to your point, I don't think he's a completely stay away, but in any type of format for me, I've already probably got to have 3 quarterbacks on my roster before I'm considering drafting Tanner Mordecai.
No doubt.
There you go. Well, that's going to do it for the Big Ten show, Mike. A long one, but a fun one, man. A lot of names. And look, we've got a while to go through preseason. We mentioned a lot of stuff that we're going to have to keep tabs on, from the wide receiver situation at Wisconsin to the Northwestern head coach situation. See if a lot of guys can make it through injury-free, but I feel pretty good that most of the content that we recorded here is going to be pretty good over the next 30, 45 days while guys prepare for their fantasy draft. So look, that's going to do it for the Big Ten show. Next time we talk another show, we're going to be going into the Pac-12. We've only got Pac-12 and SEC ready to go, only to go. So 8 of the 10 down, Mike. We're almost through.
Yep. Let's roll out of here.
Well, look, that's going to do it for my partner, Mike Bainbridge. My name's Joe DeSalvo, and that's going to take care of the Big Ten show in our preseason preview series until we do the Pac-12. We'll see you next time. Till then.